you? Welcome to the Other People Show. I'm Brad Listi. I have a bit of a cold. I don't know if you can hear it, so if I sound like I'm under the weather, I kind of am. But that is not stopping me from delivering to you a Sunday episode, and I am very delighted to have Julie Poole on the program. She is a poet who is originally from the Pacific Northwest, but now lives in Austin, Texas. She has a new collection out on Deep Vellum. It is called Bright Specimen. And it was inspired by the time that she spent in the Billy L. Turner Plant Resources Center at the University of Texas at Austin. It's very much about plants, among other things. Julie Poole has received fellowship support from the James Michener Center, the Helene Wurlitzer Foundation, and Yaddo. And in 2017, she was a finalist for the Keene Prize for Literature. I had a nice time talking with her. That is coming up in just a minute. I do have a quick announcement. If you are a journalist or a literary critic or a book blogger or a literary podcaster, and you would like a advance copy of my novel, Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, please email me at letters@otherppl.com. That's letters@otherppl.com, and I will put you on the list for a galley. My book comes out in May 2022, so we're getting galleys together and all the rest. Today's episode is brought to you by Grey Wolf Press, publisher of The Swank Hotel, the new novel by Lucy Corin. Book list says, quote, Corin's novel unveils the madness that permeates society by scrutinizing trauma, cultural expectations, and the political and economic climate of the 21st century. That's The Swank Hotel by Lucy Corin, available now from Grey Wolf Press. So I'm going to have Julie Poole read a poem to you before we get started with the interview. I do this with poets, as most of you probably know. This poem is called Iris Tenusyma. It is from Julie's collection, Bright Specimen, available now from Deep Vellum. Here is Julie Poole.
Iris started in a strange shell. Tell me what's inside the package with the hairline crack. Is it corn? Is it edible? A flower? Or a tiny red apple? If I was as strong as this long green leaf, painted over, ridged, remarkable in length, strong enough to stand erect, green, a perfect idea. When I see it, it's nearly as familiar as my mother's skin. The first leaf I touched with my baby hand, making contact, marking the sense of touch in my memory. Grasses of many textures, some sharp enough to cut, some soft enough to taste the roots of. Yes, when I was young, I put grass in my body. I pulled the young shoots out and ate their water-ripe tips. There was a faint squeak when I pulled the blade away from its roost.
Okay, that is Julie Poole reading a poem entitled Iris Tenusyma from her collection Bright Specimen, available now from Deep Vellum Press. Very pleased to share my conversation with Julie with you right now. Had a lot of fun meeting her and enjoyed this collection. So here we go. This is Julie Poole, and her new collection, one more time, is called Bright Specimen.
I started this book, and I didn't really realize that this would become a book at all. It just started as a, passion project. And I was like, I'm going to write about flowers. I'm going to encounter beauty. And I thought that that was what interested me about flowers, and especially pressed flowers. And I was, the Billy L. Turner Plant Resources Center has over 1 million specimens. So I thought in a dreamy sort of way that I might be able to stumble upon possibly one of the most beautiful plants in the world. You know, who knows? So I looked at many, many specimens. But violence became a theme that I noticed pretty early on. In fact, like maybe even day 2, just because I was working at UT, University of Texas at Austin, in the main tower. And the tower was a setting where one of the first mass school shootings occurred. So my desk was, I would say, a few feet away from the stairwell that Charles Whitman climbed to the top of in 1966 and took the lives of innocent people. So I felt like the building carried that sense of trauma still. And the more I looked at plants, the more I realized that I also carried a sense of trauma within myself, especially within my body, and that I was hiding from that. And I was looking for some activity to distract me from that bodily feeling of violence and reliving trauma.
And the trauma that you were hiding from and that was kind of living in your body was the hospitalization that you suffered through or in an earlier part of your life. Is that correct? You write about it in the afterward. So
yeah. So I was 34 when I was 33. I turned 34 when I was in the hospital. I was there for almost a month, but I was involuntarily hospitalized. I went through like a medication shift, and I stopped taking meds altogether, and just something in my brain just kind of went haywire, and I became very disconnected with reality. And yeah, involuntary commitment is really not a fun process. It's just, I didn't want to go to the hospital. I had been hospitalized 3 times before I turned 18 as a teenager.
For bipolar?
Well, at the time I was diagnosed with clinical depression, and I was always like one of those kids who really struggled with depression, and I had, a lot of self-harm tendencies, and I would say that I never wanted to take my life, but I did feel like I was testing those boundaries, and I was testing the people I loved in my life to kind of maybe take care of me and like realize that I was in a lot of pain. So those experiences in my formative years of being on psych wards as a kid, when I was a kid, I was just a teenager. They didn't have room for me in like the adolescent or children's ward. So I was put on wards with adults, and that was an interesting experience as a teenager, being in this atmosphere where, I was just incredibly sick and surrounded by people who were also really struggling too. But yeah, so I think that that's something that this book has really allowed me to talk about more and realize that it's been a part of my life. And yeah, I still struggle with my diagnosis. I don't know if I'll ever reach that point where I'm just like, yeah, I fully embrace this, because a lot of my experience of mental illness has had environmental triggers, just having a turbulent home life and not having my needs met, not having enough food, not feeling safe, not feeling like my mother was protected, feeling in constant danger. So I acted out in a way, maybe to bring attention to this problem that my family was facing. And that problem had to do with, my stepfather, who was a pretty troubled individual.
And you allude briefly as well to the loss of your father when you were 11. So this too is, I would imagine, is a part of the trauma that lives within you. How can the loss of a parent not be traumatic to us, right?
Yeah. It is. It's interesting. Like when I look at other poets, it's kind of uncanny how many poets have lost a parent. Sylvia Plath, I think, was like 10 or 11 when she lost her dad. And my dad died of a brain tumor. He had brain cancer. And my mom remarried a few months later. So I didn't really have enough time to process that he was gone because she found someone pretty quickly, and we moved right away. We moved from the house that I grew up in.
Oh, that's tough. That's tough, though, right? Because I mean, it's tough to. I think it's tough for children. It's tough for adults, but it's tough for kids to move out of their familiar environment in any context. But to have that like up against the loss of your father had to be especially difficult.
Yeah, it was. It was, and I think that, my mom didn't know how to be a parent alone. She was raised in a family where she wasn't even allowed to learn how to drive because, she was a woman. And it was expected that she get married right away. In fact, she was engaged when she was in high school to my dad, who was, I think, like 8 years older. She's still a teenager. And she tells me that in her yearbook, her classmates had written about her that she was the most likely to get married because she was engaged. And I just find that so fascinating because my mom she is so much more than that. She's an artist, she's an incredible person, but she grew up in a Catholic family. She had 7 siblings. There was really no such thing as like a woman working or having a career or going to college. So that never even was an option for her. So when my dad died, I think she was just terrified of not having this nuclear family. And man, when I walked in and I met my new quote unquote stepfather, I was blown away by the difference. Even in their stature. My dad was kind of a petite guy. He was like 5'8", and very soft-spoken, just such a gentle human being and really funny. And my stepdad, like one of my first encounters was him like trying on my father's coat and the sleeves being really too short, and him saying like, oh man, this guy was tiny. and me just like, just wanting to rip this man to shreds for like calling my dad a little guy, and for wearing his coat. It was brutal. It was brutal to see that.
Yeah,
And
that's a strange opening move. That's immediately a red flag for me when the stepfather tries on the recently deceased father's coat in front of his new stepdaughter, like as like a way of saying hello.
well, and then he pawned it. So he pawned my dad's coat, which was like a leather coat, and he used it for drugs. So my mom woke up to this reality that she didn't really know who she was marrying. It's almost comical in a way because my stepfather like installed our fake fireplace. And I was already like, this is so weird. Like, my mom had just met this man and he's installing our fireplace. And then I come home and she's like, I'm getting married. And I'm like, oh, wow.
What do you say? I mean, you're 11 years old, right? What do you say?
But the funny thing is that I felt like, my mom and I were really close. And I felt like when my father died, that I had in a way become him. And that's not uncommon, especially because I was the oldest kid. And I wasn't there when he died, but I held his hand while he was in a coma. And well, actually, more correctly, he held my hand and he started squeezing my hand and it started to hurt, but I didn't want to show that I was in pain. And then the nurses noticed that he was squeezing my hand really hard in a way that was probably some sort of reflex. So they had to peel his hand off of my hand. And he's still supposed to be in this coma. So he's having like some sort of recognition. And I felt his life like kind of enter my own at that point. So, yeah.
That's wild. I mean, and not, that doesn't sound crazy to me. That sounds, I mean, because you are him. You're made of him. I mean, there is no separation between the two of you when you really get down into it.
Absolutely.
And I think there are many documented cases of people being in comas, especially I think when a child is there. I think of my grandmother who, in her final years, had dementia, and one of her children was severely mentally disabled, her youngest, and she was gone. Like my dad would go in and he would say, and she barely recognized him at all. But then my Uncle Brian would go in and she would suddenly come back online. It was wild.
Yeah.
Because she, and it was really touching to see. Like she would suddenly look up and like take his hand, say his name, like it's a little bit of mysterious how it all works. But the fact that your presence and probably your voice, I would imagine you were talking a little bit, as you were there. Because they say that auditory sense is one of the last to go, right? If somebody's not conscious, they can often still hear. Or if they're not.
Wow.
Yeah, so maybe he heard and then, I don't know, who knows. But it squares with what I've like read and heard through the years about people in the final stages of life and like what they're aware of, and then just that deep connectivity. And also what a powerful and kind of scary and sad experience for you as a child, like how heartbreaking.
Yeah, I think, I love that I got to know someone like that. And it's strange because, when I knew that my dad kind of wanted boys. Like I sensed that, like he had three girls. And I think that, like he would take us fishing or we'd play baseball or he'd try to teach me how to play basketball. And so, yeah, I think that I always sensed that, like maybe he would have preferred a son, but then he at some point he shifted and was like, oh, having daughters is actually the coolest thing. And we we interacted on a different level. But I don't think that I would have if I didn't have my dad as that sort of role model of who a man could be, I think that I might have encountered my stepfather and thought, well, this is just how all men are. And so I'm so grateful that I had, someone to look up to until the age of 11 and, be kind of in awe of. Yeah.
Well, no, it's a huge blessing to have loving parents. Not everybody does.
Yeah.
Not everybody does. And when you don't, it's a difficult road, to say the least. And, the thing you said earlier about a lot of poets having lost a parent, I think of like poet friends of mine, and maybe like the poet friend of mine who embodies my idea of what it means to be a poet the most, like there's something very pure and true about him. He lost his little sister to leukemia when he was a kid. So not the loss of a parent, but, lost a sister and suffered through stepfather abuse as well. So interesting parallels. I think, I guess it makes a kind of obvious sense that having to go through really tough stuff at any stage of life, but maybe especially when you're a kid, can't help but deepen you in some ways. It forces your hand. You have to grow through it. The alternative is what,
Yeah.
So you have the loss of your father, the difficulty of living with this abusive, it sounds like an addict stepfather, and then the resulting mental illness or psychological issues. And, you brought up a really interesting point. It's something I've wondered at myself through the years, this kind of nature-nurture question around, depression, as just one example. Doctors may hand out diagnoses based on one's condition, not always taking into account the life experiences one has been through or the environment one lives in. And maybe, especially in Western medicine, in that paradigm, they might have a tendency to overcorrect in the direction of neurochemistry and biology and not give much credence to the fact that, this young person lost a parent. This young person's in an unsafe household,
Yeah.
And I guess, it sounds like maybe that was the case for you, especially when it comes to hospitalization.
Yeah. And I grew up in the 80s, and so I started really, I was medicated in the 90s, and, I remember this is when psych meds are actually pretty new in terms of giving them to kids and stuff. And I don't think that there was really that research there yet that showed what happens to a developing brain that's on, a lot of medications. And later on, there are clear warnings now on a lot of medications that if you give them to minors, it can cause suicidal ideation. So, part of me wonders, like, how much of that was the result of, I don't know how to say this, like being a kind of a guinea pig for for meds. I don't know. Like, it's very controversial. It's a very sticky subject, and I know that my doctors did the best that they could. But I do also remember, like, things that came up that were really quite shocking when I think about them now, especially like my psychiatrist recommending, like, if I didn't get better, to have electroconvulsive therapy. And they've shown that, when you give electroconvulsive therapy to kids, it can, or even adults, it can cause long-term memory damage.
Right. Yeah, I remember reading about that. I'm trying to think of, maybe it was, I was reading like a biography of Ernest Hemingway. I want to say he was treated with that. But that was kind of common treatment, I think, in mid-20th century American medicine for people who were dealing with severe depression or severe mental illness. Yeah.
So, yeah, it is interesting. I do wonder, like, what would have happened if I just would have been able to express what I was feeling and been given some coping skills, maybe, because that's really all I've wanted in life, even as an adult, to, like, figure out how to navigate having an illness and living a healthy life. I think, like, everyone wants that. Everyone wants to live a healthy life. I mean, part of the reason I wrote this book is I was in a weird, like, numb pain. I didn't really feel anything. And I was like, I can't meditate.
Why?
I'm like, well, like, I want to believe that meditation, and I've been told that meditation has, very positive effects. But for me, like, sitting with my thoughts for even 10 minutes is dangerous sometimes, and trying to get to that place of quiet. And so part of my process in looking at these plants, like looking at these broad side sheets of plants, 20, 30 plants a day, was an act of meditation. It was an act of, like, putting myself in a meditative mindset that allowed me to surrender those harmful, negative, scary thoughts that I was having and focus on something, so much so that I was looking at it I was looking at the plants, not only, like, directly looking at them, but I was looking at them through a magnifier that had this light on it. And so I could see every detail, the smallest details in a petal, the stems, and I was just in awe. It was like going to MoMA in a way, like going to an art museum and seeing something and saying, oh, this is the coolest sculpture I've ever seen, or this, I've never seen a color like this before, or I've never seen a texture like this before. And having that image be the focus of everything, and just the incredible amount of feeling that came from that. I'm looking at something that's supposedly dead, and I know it's not alive anymore. It's been uprooted. Some of these plants are like hundreds of years old.
How do they preserve them? How do they stay, like, in any kind of shape to be even looked at if they're hundreds of years old?
Well, that's a great question. Sometimes there was a chemical process that was used, and sometimes not. It depends on whether or not plants are vascular plants, or I'm sorry, I'm not a botanist. I'm probably screwing this up, but say for instance, an orchid. An orchid isn't going to preserve as well as a plant that's a vascular plant like a pansy. Orchids are very delicate and hard to preserve. But they're basically just on sheets of paper, and they dry out. A lot of them lose, a lot of the color. They're not as vibrant. Some of them are incredibly vibrant. Plants from the tropics, for instance, it's just incredible. You could look at a plant from South America and just it'll blow your mind. But they're on these big sheets of paper laid flat, and then they're put in folders, and then stored in these kind of like hermetically sealed cabinets. And the cabinets are supposed to ideally keep out bugs. They're dark. It's like you don't want light on the plants. You don't want an overexposure of air. Like the biggest danger in an herbarium is water damage and bugs, like a bug infestation, or obviously fire. So yeah, they're incredibly delicate. And when I had to move them, we would never turn it like a page of a book. That would obviously be really stupid. You have to lift each document up and move it aside and then set it down. So I was so incredibly lucky that the curator trusted me to do this because, number one, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a botanist. I'm a stinking poet, and who knows what kind of drugs I'm on. And so it's like, and it was just an incredible experience that they trusted me to take on this project, and they welcomed me into this space, which was like very quiet. It was like working in a library. I basically got the perfect office for myself and this project to work on. And each week I'd come in and I'd say, well, I'd really like to look at snapdragons today. And George Yatskovich, he's the curator. He's a doctor botanist, brilliant individual. I think he's probably the smartest person I've ever met. When he would talk to me about plants, I'd be like, yes, I understand absolutely nothing you're saying right now. He was incapable of putting anything in like layman's terms, which I so appreciated. It was so lovely, like everything, like the Latin names, like the very like scientific language that he would tell me about. He was really like trying to teach me, and a lot of it, some of it stuck with me, and some of it didn't, unfortunately.
I can relate to that. I would have been at a loss.
Yeah, but he was just so incredibly kind. And part of it was like, I just made a list of plants. I was like, and a lot of them had something to do with like some sort of stage in my life. Like snapdragons had kind of a sentimental association for me. Like I used to take them and you could pinch the corners of the flower and kind of make them talk, I don't know if you ever did that when you were a kid, like make a snapdragon talk.
I don't think, I grew up in the Midwest. Do we have snapdragons in the Midwest? I don't even know.
So yeah, snapdragons are fun because they look like they have tongues and they look like they have mouths. And you could be like, "Roar, I'm a dragon," They're just the coolest things. And so I remember doing that as a kid, and I wanted to look at them. and look at a lot of them and just kind of meditate on that experience.
Okay, I need to stop you here because I think there's an interesting point to make, maybe like a dissonance between what you said earlier about not being able to meditate and to sit with your thoughts because it can be dangerous. I get that. I actually have a friend who is diagnosed as bipolar who told me much the same. Like meditation is intolerable to him. For I think that reason, because the voice, the jabbering, the static is just too loud and maybe too dark or something. But everything that you're describing to me, and you keep saying the word meditative or meditation, I mean, to sit in an herbarium in a quiet room for hours on end, looking at the granular detail of plant after plant after plant, and finding a sense of deep peace in that's every bit as much meditation to me as sitting on a cushion and observing one's thoughts. It's just a different mode, right?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I feel that strongly. I feel like, one of the biggest influences in my work is the work of John Berger, who wrote Ways of Seeing. He wrote about art history and how important it is to look at art and to look at art incredibly closely and like with an eye for detail. And that just seems so important to me. And in doing so, and like looking at something and focusing on it, you do feel a sense of time lifting, but also a sense of connection too, which ideally that is what like loving kindness meditation would give someone, is like a sense of connection to all beings. And I would love to get to a state where, I can meditate, because I do think it's a very healthy practice. I just couldn't do it at that time. And during the pandemic, I haven't been able to. But I can observe things up close and pay attention. And I'm so grateful for that. I'm so grateful for that ability to trust myself and to pay attention in some way. Because I started this project like right after, in 2017, I was still in shock over the result of the elections. I was in shock over the loss of a friend. I was like in shock over so many different things in my life. And then on top of all of this, I was remembering what had happened to me while I was in the hospital. And I found this space that felt both safe, but at the same time, like the space was still hurting from the trauma that I don't know if that sounds nutty.
No, it doesn't. You mean the trauma of the shooting in the tower?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, because
I think I'm perfectly willing to go with you on this notion that a physical space can be inhabited by, like, for lack of a better way of putting it, the ghosts of its past, and that like a certain energy can linger in a space for good or for ill. Because like, I think we've all had that experience of like walking into a beautiful building or into a beautiful space or into a beautiful setting in nature, and having just a sense of its energy. And how could you be anywhere near that tower and have any knowledge of its history and not have some sense of the dark energies and the sadness that lived in there, right? I mean, I don't know. That doesn't feel too far afield for me.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. It's so funny because, I think like I'm thinking of myself more in terms of, as a human species, we are soaking up our environment. We are sensitive to our environment. And there are some people who are more sensitive than others. And I think that as much as I really resisted this for a long time, I think I'm really sensitive to my environment, the spaces that I walk into, where I feel safe. And I was trying to almost create this space for myself within my imagination. I pictured being able to read these poems to myself after I finished the work that there was a certain point where I spent 6 months doing this. And then there's this certain point where it's okay, I feel like I'm done. I felt like I completed this. And then all of the poems went into a box and I didn't really know what to do with them. And I write longhand, which, is just how I write poems. Tons of spelling mistakes, sometimes I can't even read my own handwriting, but I have to feel in contact with the page. And especially in this setting, I felt like I needed to be in contact, moving a pen across the page, almost as an act of translation. Looking at the forms I was seeing, and I was well, how can I translate what I'm seeing into language?
Okay, can I stop you for a second? Because I'm now thinking of your mother's artistic gifts as a watercolorist, correct? She's a painter. I'm seeing a corollary here between her ability to look closely at something and render it on a canvas or on a sheet of paper or whatever and paint, and the work that you're doing as a poet. Did that ever occur to you?
Oh, no, actually. That makes me really happy. Because, my mom came to art as a way to cope with trauma in her life. And she practiced at it. And she would draw faces. That was her way of communicating with herself. And then she moved on to other forms, oil painting, watercolors. After my father died, she stopped making art for a really long time. And when I started writing these poems, I asked her if she would be willing to do some watercolors of some of the flowers. And, she told me botanicals are really hard. It's hard to capture in detail a plant. If you're out of practice, it could be really difficult. And so her approach was to use watercolor on tissue paper, which shocked me because that's making things 10 times harder.
I was going to say, right? Doesn't that, I feel like that would just bleed everywhere, the colors, right?
Yes. So she was really trying to be meticulous. And for some reason, she was I have to use tissue paper. And then she cut the tissue paper out and mounted it on cardstock watercolor paper. And it struck me later that this was really the perfect way to represent the plants and the delicate nature of them and the sort of layers and dimensions of that I was seeing. So I was excited that she got on board to do these paintings. Yeah, I hope that she finds her groove again.
Yeah, she's good.
That's where. Thank you. Yeah.
So you have this collection of poems. Like you've done this as like an exercise to process trauma, either directly or indirectly, to find safe space, like some place of peace, which I think especially, I can relate to that, especially in the sense of the aftermath of the 2016 election. I think I was traumatized by that. I think a lot of us were. I remember quitting social media, like reading a lot, writing a lot of letters. Like I was just like, oof, it was a lot to deal with. So I get how doing something like this, like looking at plants and being in this tower on campus, could be like a lovely kind of escape or daily ritual to kind of find some sanity in this world. I'm curious about the point at which you shifted from it being kind of this lovely, enjoyable exercise and meditation practice to you feeling like you had a collection of poems to publish.
Well, it's funny because there's a way in which, like, poets lose money making poetry. So I couldn't afford to submit my manuscript out. And I didn't even have a manuscript done. I had like 375 poems, and I was like, okay, this is nuts. You know, I have to figure out how to make a manuscript. And I used a deadline, and the deadline was a free submission for a small press that I really had a lot of respect for. And a friend told me, like, if you want to submit to this small press, you have to do it at midnight, as soon as that submission period opens, because so many people will be submitting, because poets pay like anywhere between $35 to $65 to submit a manuscript to publishers. And that can really, for someone like me, that could really take a chunk out of your bank account. So I gave myself a week to kind of order the manuscript, to put it together. I put the poems up on the wall. I read them, and at midnight, I didn't have Wi-Fi, but I knew where I could get Wi-Fi. And it was like across the street at this real estate office. And I like stayed up until midnight, and as soon as midnight struck, I like walked across the street, was sitting on the curb, uploading my manuscript, and I sent it, and I was like, I felt so happy. And of course, like, you know, it was rejected, you know, and I was like, oh, I guess I'm never going to do anything with this book. It's so funny. It's like, I never realized how like hard I take rejection, or how, like this warped idea I have of rejection. I'll be like, okay, one place, that was enough.
I was going to say, just take one swing at bat. You swung and you missed, and that's it. It's over. Done.
I was relieved in a way. I was relieved because I was like, okay, now I can just go into a box with all the other books that I have, not finished and not submitted anywhere. And I can be happy just to have it. And the only reason the book exists is a friend of mine asked me if she could submit the manuscript to her publisher, Deep Vellum, Tenusyma. Her book is amazing. It's called The Nightgown. And she knew that Deep Vellum was looking for other Texas-based poets to publish. And she sent them my manuscript. And I didn't hear back, and I wasn't thinking that I would hear back. And I heard back, and they were like, well, we want to publish this. And I was like, are you sure? Like, really? And then it just kind of morphed from there into book form. And to tell the truth, I had a lot of demands. And Deep Vellum is so sweet because they met those demands. One of my biggest demands was I really need this book to be printed sustainably. I need it to be on recycled paper. I need it to be I need it not to take from the earth if you can, in any way, shape, or form. Please, this is very important to me. And they did it. And I was so happy with that. They gave me so much creative control. My friend designed the cover. The layout artist was incredible. He was like, well, can I just move this line here because it's not fitting? And I was like, absolutely not.
Don't touch my lines.
Don't. And it was so strange because, I have a hard time advocating for myself, but I realized when it comes to my work, I have no problem. I'll just defend it and I'll be like, okay, not in a million years is that word going to be moved. So yeah, this strange aspect of myself came up. But I think that artists have to fight for their work,
I can imagine you being actually very effective as an advocate for your own work because you're very soft-spoken and sweet. And I think that might add some power to when you put your foot down. People go, oh, I don't know. I can imagine. Whereas somebody who's maybe a little bit more, boorish or hyperverbal or something, someone might hear them talking and be like, oh, yeah, But I think there's something powerful about somebody who's soft-spoken speaking up.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's just so funny because I've been around books for so long, and part of me doesn't feel those romantic feeling towards them. I'm like, okay, yeah, it's great to be published, but it's even better to be published in a way where you're happy with the end result. It's I have friends who are just like, oh man, I hated my cover. I was like, well, did you ask them to do anything? And they're like, no, I was just happy to have a book out. And I don't think like that. I think that it's a whole thing. And in fact, if it were up to me, this book would be biodegradable. You'd be able to throw it in your compost pile after you're done with it, and it would disintegrate, and there would be seeds in it, and they would sprout wildflowers.
Wait, I want to say there has been a book like that. Isn't that
really?
Yes, I want to say
oh
there
my
was.
Gosh.
But it was it was maybe a one-off or some sort of experimental thing, and I could be totally misremembering, but it's one of those things that probably crossed my eyes when I was looking at a computer screen. Like a story about a book that you could plant. After you finish reading it. And I mean, technology, that's doable. If you've got biodegradable materials and recycled paper or whatever, and you somehow embed some seeds in there, plant your book.
Yes, absolutely. I think that I would love to see more creativity and publishing in terms of how we even think about the materials that we use to make books. I think that it's been a while since there's been any sort of real innovation, I think.
Well, I mean, you got the ebook, but that's maybe different.
Yeah, and the ebook is great. It serves a great purpose. I think that for me, I would love all mass market titles to just stay on ebook. Just go straight to ebook. And then, maybe print the special stuff.
Right. But who gets to decide? Who gets to decide what the special stuff is becomes the question. Right?
I know. Yeah, I put myself in charge. And say, you know what? No, yeah, it's silly, but I do think there has to be some changes in terms of, publishing and quote unquote green publishing, which is kind of taking a back seat.
Well, but I feel like that's bullshit. Why can't publishers use recycled paper?
It's not cheap. And it's so funny because when I was like super adamant, I was like, I need this. I need readers to know that this was for certified recycled paper, because so many publishers, they might use like a certain percentage, but it's just not economically. It's just printing is expensive, and it's also it goes through so many different processes. Like a book will just like, it goes through so many different hands and those, and all over the world. And it's just like one of those structures that I would love to research and better understand, because it doesn't really make any sense. It's not like books are printed locally. Like, not, you don't go to the farmer's market and get a local book or something like that. The paper comes from someplace it's just like very convoluted.
I feel like, though, if like one of these big, like, Random House or something just made a company-wide decision to only use recycled paper, that would automatically bring the price down, right? Because
yes,
you could order in bulk. That's what we need. We need these big conglomerates to take the reins, and then suddenly the market would magically shift and prices would come down.
Yeah, and I think in the UK there's actually been a much bigger push to do that. I think a lot of publishers in the UK, I think UK Penguin in UK does recycled paper. I don't know if that is applicable in the US, but it's something I have to research. But it's something I'm really interested in, being that I'm from the Northwest and I've seen firsthand what deforestation looks like.
Where are you from?
I know I grew up in Seattle, but I lived all around Washington, and I remember like living in right near the border, Blaine, Washington, which is a tiny little town, and driving up through like these hills and then seeing like clear cutting. And actually one of the first memories I have of environmental activism is looking at the side of the landscape, and someone had taken the fallen logs, and this is a pretty bold statement, and spelled out with the logs rape. Washington has a huge logging community. When you think of like the typical lumberjack individual, there are tons of paper mills and stuff, but they're not active as much anymore. That kind of disappeared. That wasn't it. That industry just really fell apart. But I did see like some of the impact of that and what it looks like.
What does it
look
like?
It looks like someone took like if you have short hair, like say you're going to give yourself a really terrible haircut, and you take like a electrical razor and you just shave like one side of your head, like this really weird spot. It's not uniform, it's not like this, but it's like it has a very eerie effect, and you just feel this sense of vacancy. You'll see like the surrounding pine trees, and then you'll see this vast expanse of tree trunks, like lopped off tree trunks, and this if you see it early on, there's like an almost like a bright red color, which is, maybe I'm over influenced by, I don't know if you ever saw that movie Fern Gully.
No.
It's like an old Disney film.
Oh,
Fern
right.
Gully was
Right. Yeah, I know. I think I've...
about, yeah, it was basically about like this, hungry deforestation happening. Anyway, I don't know why I thought of that. But yeah, the impact is real in terms of like soil erosion and all this other stuff. So this is to say I have some conflict about what it means to make a book as someone who writes books. Is there a way that I can do it that, doesn't take anything? I don't know.
It's sustainable. Your thoughts? It's the issue of sustainability. Yeah, sustainability, like wanting to like have a light, like a small footprint. I get that.
People have kind of weird responses sometimes, like to that. Like I live in Texas, and I was like recently, actually not recently. This was like a year ago. I asked my landlord. I was like, "Hey, can we get compost?" And he started laughing. And he's like, "Compost?" I live in Austin. And I was like, "Yeah, compost, like, can we get it like a compost bin?" And he's like, "Oh no, I'd have to pay for that, and it's the things I grew up with in Seattle, like composting, everyone composts, it's just like everyone has a compost bin. Who doesn't compost? But here in Texas, it's like composting is like a privilege. Like if I go a block over, I live in like a really wealthy zip code. I live in like a piece of shit apartment, but I live in a wealthy zip code. So if I go a block over, I'll find all of these compost bins, and I'll just like pine. Look at like this maternal like womb yearning. I just want to fucking compost. And so I have all these bags of compost in my freezer right now, because at night sometimes I'll be like, okay, well, I really want to compost and I don't have compost, so I'm going to see if I can drop my compost into someone else's bin. And people get pissed.
Yeah,
if
it's a weird thing. I do that sometimes, like if I take my dog for a walk and my dog poops, and I'll like pick it up, and then I'm like, is it okay if I throw this in their trash can? It's like,
yeah.
I mean, it's not like I would go up to somebody's house and like find their trash can, but if it's like out at the curb, I'm like, what does it matter to them? But then I've gotten like a dirty look before, like, don't throw your dog shit in my trash can. And then I'm like, but you're not looking when are you spending time inside your trash can? It's not going to bother you. What is your issue? You're being uptight.
I walked past one compost bin that had like some newfangled kind of plastic lock on it, and it was like, like.
I mean, God, people are crazy.
But anyway, so I'm storing it up. I have no idea where my compost is going, but
you have some. You're actively storing compost?
Yes, I have too much compost in my freezer right now. And my idea was to collect enough compost so that I would reach my own body weight.
My God, this is a level of commitment that I feel like I don't have much precedent for in my human experience. I
have a point to prove, man.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like, why is it so hard for cities to? A lot of people in a lot of cities don't even have access to recycling. That's a huge problem.
Yeah, I live in Los Angeles. I don't know any. I mean, I've never composted. I don't think there's a composting option.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh man. Yeah, it's so funny. I'm not sure how much of an effect it has, but I'm sure that, if, it takes longer in a landfill to degrade. That's why composting is, in theory, a better practice.
It's also good
But
for the
yeah,
soil, isn't it? Like that compost, you add it to your garden or whatever, and it's great.
you do tons of stuff. And it's kind of like a fun project too. If you want to take it on yourself, I was trying to figure out like I don't have any green space around me at all. So I was like, I don't have a place to like, if I were to like figure out some method of composting, and there's actually a great Japanese method of composting where you can have a box in your home. And I don't know like what sort of materials you need, but I read about this technique where you can compost at home and do it in a way so that you would never smell it. And you're just like mixing it, and there's like some sort of essential substance. My brain's kind of breaking down, but I
You
read
and me
this
both.
article. I read this article in the New York Times about this technique, and that you could live in an apartment and compost and have that compost and it not smell. And I was like, well, that's cool. And you just mix it around and put all your banana peels in there. And but then I was like, well, where would I put the dirt? And so then I was like, okay, well, could I go to a park and put the dirt in the park? Like, is that illegal? Like, what happens here? Like,
Right.
how can we work this out? How can we work this out, folks?
You need like a community garden at your apartment building, I think is what you need.
Yeah.
I mean, that shouldn't be too cost intensive. I think your landlord should provide.
Yeah, he's a great guy. He's like classic Texan though. He's like, combos. What sort of liberal hippie shit are you talking about?
I mean, and this is like this talk of like a recycled paper book and composting and
Yeah.
having and also just like the interest in and ability to sit looking carefully at plants all day long. Like this is very hippie. I think would be
It's so hippie.
yeah. I mean, but you're from the Pacific Northwest, like you've got all the credentials, and I have a lot of affection for a lot of hippie culture. I've argued through the years that it gets short shrift. I think it's easy to caricature, but I think a lot of the impulses, especially around the environment, but also around things like psychedelics and those would be the two big ones, like the environmental and ecological arguments that hippies were making way back in the day, the interest in psychedelics that they had way back in the day, and the things that they were trying to say about their value and importance. All that stuff got kind of like rolled up into this kind of cartoon version of hippiedom. And now I think, we're seeing all of that stuff get reappraised, or it's been in the process of reappraisal for a while, but it turns out they were right and their instincts were good, would be my assessment.
Yeah. I'm a total hippie, and I'm really embracing that. It's just everything from, I did a yoga video and I was like, the yoga instructor this morning was just YouTube, and I was like, she lifted her arms and she had hairy armpits, and I was like, hell yeah.
These are my people.
And I was like, this is it. This is it.
The way that because I feel somewhat similar. Like I'm kind of like, yeah, I think I'm kind of a hippie, and I think that might just be a way for me to put a word on my instinct and desire to live at odds with mainstream cultural values.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what it's about for me. It's like sort of feeling like, there's this big herd of humanity marching in one direction and ingesting certain things and celebrating certain things and having an aversion to a lot of it. And hearing my instincts tell me, like, this isn't the way for you, And I think I like to believe there's some wisdom in that. It's hard for me to look at mainstream culture and politics and just the bulk of, like, look where we've gotten to. Like, yes, we've made some progress as a species, but, like, the planet is basically in the process of disgorging itself of us because we've abused it so badly. And the American experiment is on the brink still, I think today, we're talking on August 13th. Today's supposedly the day of Donald Trump's reinstatement, according to, like, a terrifyingly large subset of our population who believes this garbage and who thinks that he's, like, some sort of great leader. Like, we're in a pretty fucked up state. There's a lot to have aversion to, I guess, would be my argument. Like, maybe we should reconsider what we're doing, how we're working, how we're living, what we're valuing, and how we relate to reality. So, like, I don't know, I'm kind of on your wavelength. Like, this whole project of sitting there looking at plants and writing poetry, at least in partial response to the contemporary state of things post-2016, that's right up my alley. I'm like, okay, there's a sane human being responding as best she can to this and also to the deep stuff of her life. The stuff that is monolithic in a way. It's the stuff that must be contended with. I don't understand how a person with an artistic bent could go through the things that you've been through and not find a way to address it in her art. It would be crazy to me to do otherwise. And also maybe an admirable achievement in avoidance. But, like, I don't know, just kudos to you for finding a way, that made sense to you and that was palatable and tolerable to you, and kind of going through that alchemic process, like the alchemy of taking bad stuff. I mean, as we continue on this theme of composting, like, it's kind of similar, though, is it not? I mean, it's like it's a way of taking the difficult stuff of life and turning it into art, which is what most all of us are doing one way or another. And you found your way.
Yeah, I really believe that's my purpose. I don't think I'm 41. Like, I think I would have given up a long time ago if I didn't believe on some level that I had something to say. So, because the reward for making a poem it just doesn't really have, like, a big monetary
right
return, and nor does, like, really looking closely at nature. I taught course on just, like, writing nature poetry, and I was like, oh no, how am I going to make this not cheesy? And I think that what I realized in teaching that class is that people really do want to talk about their experiences of what they see. Even if you live in an urban landscape, you are surrounded by nature. You are surrounded by it. Like, you see something every day that your brain is absorbing, but you might not talk to a friend about it. And so this was a space where people would talk about, like, a blue heron that they had seen, or a butterfly that they were like, that thing was, like, as big as a bat. Or, like, right now in Austin, there's this huge, in my neighborhood at least, huge boom of bunny rabbits. There's bunny rabbits everywhere. And it's remarkable. And I'm like, what if this was, like, the first thing? What if it was the first thing that came up in a conversation with a friend. Not like the state of the world, but how many bunny rabbits are currently.
or like people talking about work.
Yes.
I'm so fucking sick of people being like, so how's, especially guys. Guys are always like, so how's the office and what's going on? You making deals? And it's just like, ugh, give me a, like, I need to remove myself from this dialogue.
People see things in nature, even in an urban environment, that are like miraculous. I've seen, I don't know if you know what a grackle is, but it's basically a bird that's like, call it a Texas crow. It's not a very attractive bird, to tell you the truth. But I saw a grackle playing like basically soccer with this acorn with a squirrel.
Are you sure? Were you on anything at the time?
I was not.
Sober as a judge.
It was so weird. I was seeing these two animals, and they were playing. This bird and this squirrel were, I shit you not, like playing with an acorn nut. And I was like, what is happening? Yeah. But it's so funny because it's not something that, you know, I think like would be the first topic of conversation.
I was just going to say, if you break the ice with that at like at the cocktail party, people are just going to be like, "Whoa, somebody hit the vape pen in the parking lot or whatever."
Jeez.
But I think too, like, not only is it interesting to me to talk about nature and nature experiences, because I don't know how to deal with life without having some contact with nature, and I live in Los Angeles, which. Mm-hmm. You know, as you say, even if you live in an urban environment, you're surrounded by it. And maybe to a particularly intense degree, that is the case in Southern California, because you have this massive city, but you're in this basin, you know, like ringed by mountain ranges and the ocean. And I mean, it's a really intense natural environment, even though a lot of that natural environment has been depleted by human development or whatever. It's still there. And what I notice when I go hiking, for example, is how easy it is to miss stuff. Like, I often wonder at how many times I've missed a coyote, like standing feet from me in the bushes or something, or if I've ever been tracked. Like, there's a mountain lion that lives in Griffith Park, which is sort of a mythical beast. There's one mountain lion that crossed like the 101 and the 405 freeways and is essentially entrapped in this small section of the park, or I guess it's entrapped in the park. I don't know if there are sections of the park that exist on the other side of the freeway, but it's like the lion's name, I think, is P21. That's the name that the rangers have given it. And there's one instance where it crawled into a crawl space underneath the house in Los Feliz. But otherwise, it sort of minds its business, even though there's like tons and tons of people in this park every day. And I have wondered, because I've hiked up there so much, I've wondered in the past if it's ever had its eyes on me. I have to believe at least once, right?
Yeah, it seems like the chances of an encounter like that are actually pretty high.
But you don't hear about, occasionally you'll hear about somebody seeing it. Like, it'll pick up on somebody's like Ring doorbell video, you know, at night. It'll be walking through the neighborhood. But it does, you know, these animals, especially these big cats, they are very good at hiding. And so I've never seen it. And I think about all the times I've missed things. And just the other day I was hiking and I was coming down and I was kind of lost in the chatter of my brain. And I wasn't looking. And then I caught myself not looking. And I was like, oh, like, look around. Like, quit looking at your feet, you know, and like jabbering at yourself the whole time you're out on this supposed nature walk. And like, just as I looked up, a hawk like zoomed right in front of me across my sight line and then like soared down over this valley. And I would have totally missed it.
Yeah.
You know, so like, who knows, like on a daily basis, like we're walking wherever we're going, we're driving, like, you know, I would guess we miss like 90% of the good stuff just because we're not awake.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. And when you do catch it, it's incredible.
Yeah. You're like, oh,
It's hard to describe too because you don't want to. It's like one of those experiences that you don't want. You're like worried if someone's gonna think you're kind of, I don't know, cheesy. For like I had that worry because I collect butterflies, but I collect them after they've already died. And I've been collecting them for like 4 years now, and I don't have a car.
how many you got?
I've got about 16. And this has taken a long time for me to do because they just fall out of the sky. And well, not at the not this isn't a simultaneous action, but because I walk everywhere, I'll find one on the sidewalk. And some of them are just fucking incredible, like huge. And I don't know.
Wait. I have to stop you because I don't think I've ever seen a dead butterfly on the ground. Maybe it's because of where I live, but.
Well, I think like Texas is a pretty incredible spot in terms of the amount of species that pass through this state on their journey. A lot of monarch butterflies, a lot of really cool things. And so around this time of year, I will find butterflies on the ground and, take them. I've gotten into the habit of I take like a little brown paper bag with me whenever I'm out because I never know when I'm going to find one. And I've been trying to like I want to take photos of them and figure out their names. Who are you? Where did you come from? I've had situations where I've found identical butterflies in almost the same spot outside of my apartment, years apart.
What do you do with them? How do you preserve them?
Well, that is something that I need to get better at. Ideally, you would have a box, like a container that would keep out insects. But as a broke poet, I just have them out on my counter, which is not a good idea, by the way, because I found one of my butterflies had looked like a hole through its wing, and I was like, oh man, I don't know if it was a cockroach. I was like, who is eating my butterflies? And it's just I have to find a way. So next, there's another stimulus check. The first thing I'm getting is a butterfly box because I love these guys, and they just fall out of the sky, and I collect them. I sometimes find money too, so it pays.
And you collect that as well.
I found $5 the other day. I walk try to get my 10,000 steps in. I'm obsessed.
Yeah, I'm kind of that way.
Obsessed with step tracking. And so I'm either finding butterflies or money.
Both are great, right? It's a nice balance.
Yeah.
Well, I have so enjoyed talking with you and enjoyed reading your collection and admire you for like this kind of project because it is, I think, at least in the context of modern American culture, in left field, like to sit there and to look at nature and to write poetry about it and to be quiet and meditative and attentive to this sort of stuff and to really have deep respect for your environment and for the plants and animals that we share our space with. Again, it can be like easy to make a cartoon out of that, and kudos to you for ignoring that because we need more people, I think, who understand that interconnectivity and respect it and pay homage to it.
Thanks, Brad. I mean, I hope if you see the cougar and you come eye to eye, you're like, hey, buddy.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it won't be like, you look like dinner.
Yeah, like the one time the cougar is like, you know what? I've been a little too nice to y'all.
Well, listen, and may I ask, are you working on any other writing projects, or are you just enjoying the publication of this one?
Yeah, I'm working on a memoir about my experience with mental illness, and yeah, I'm also a freelance writer, so I'm always working on something.
Well, I'm excited, having read especially the afterword in your poetry collection. I'm very excited to read that memoir because you've got quite a story to tell, I think. So I'll be keeping an eye out for it. Best of luck with it.
Thank you so much.
All right, there we have it. That is my conversation with Julie Poole, author of the poetry collection Bright Specimen, available now from Deep Vellum. You can find Julie on the internet at juliepooljp.com. That's Poole with an E. juliepooljp.com. Once again, the collection is called Bright Specimen. Go get your copy right now. The Other People podcast is offered freely. Did you know that? Every single episode, more than 700 and counting, all available to you, the listener, free of charge. It's a listener-supported show. If you like this program, support this program if you can. You can do that at patreon.com/otherpplpod. That's Patreon, patreon.com/otherpplpod. There are different tiers, different levels of support for as little as $1 a month. You can support this show. $1 a month. Just drop $1 in the hat every month. And, if you have the means, you can go up the scale. When you go up the scale, you get stuff. T-shirt, tote bag, coffee mug, sticker, book club subscription. I will write you a postcard. I will wish you a happy birthday. All that stuff. Patreon.com/otherpplpod. Also, if you want to help the show out, give it a little boost, you can rate it and review it over at Apple Podcasts. Give it a nice rating, write a review. That helps other people find the show. It helps the show algorithmically. If you have something to say to me, the email address for the show is letters@otherppl.com. Don't forget, too, that this podcast has its own official app, the Other People with Brad Listi app. It, too, is free. Go get the app. The Other People podcast now has a YouTube channel. Are you aware of this? Every single episode of this show is available on the Other People YouTube channel. Search for it by name, Other PPL with Brad Listi, over at YouTube, and subscribe. Hit the subscribe button. It's free. All right, a new episode coming up on Wednesday. Get ready. Get ready. Get in the ready position.